Okay, today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Mem Vav. A week of learning is sponsored by Rhonda and David Newman in memory of Rhonda's father, Yosef Eliezer ben Yaakov Yitzchak Zichrono Livracha, on his 18th Yurtzeit. Today's Daf is sponsored by Ira and Netanya Slamovitz in memory of the Shloshim of Ira's mother, Lillian Slamovitz, Ahuva Bat Rivka, and Asher Tzvi Zichrono Livracha. Zichrona Livracha. Sorry. And by Moshe Morgenstern in honor of his mother, Leah Mohammed Morgenstern. I honor your dedication to learn the daf every day. I'm very proud of you. Okay, we're going to start from the bottom of Mem He Amud Bet. If you remember, we had this very confusing Mishnah. The Mishnah started off by saying that when it comes to chametz, we had this case where we had a crack in the bowl. Again, you have to always say that when you think about the days of recycling, and we're so careful about it, we think it's a modern concept, but in those days, it was just part of their life, right? You had a crack. What did you use? You used a dough, right? You didn't start buying glue or some sort of material to fill your crack. You have a dough around, great, use it, fill in your crack. The question is, yesterday was what's its status on Pesach? Do you have to get rid of it or not? We said it depends if it's kazayit or less than the kazayit. Then we had all different interpretations of Shmuel, who narrowed this, right? There was a whole debate about how exactly to understand this, but let's just go back to the simple reading. It's kazayit or less than a kazayit. It all depends on the size, whether you have to get rid of it or not. Then the Mishnah said, V'chein le'inyan tuma, and it's the same for the purposes of tuma. And then it said, Im makpid alav chotzetz, v'im chotze b'kiyumo hareu ka'areva. But then it's kind of shifted gears. First it said, V'chein le'inyan tuma, which would make it sound. Now, because it's talking about chatzitza later on in the Mishnah, we assume that what they mean is, when you take a bowl and you tovel it in the mikvah, if it has something external on it, like this dough, is it considered external and it makes a chatzitza, meaning you can't tovel the bowl, or is it not? So if you view the words v'chein le'inyan tuma the way they sound, which is it's the exact same thing for tuma, meaning if it's a kazayit, how will we apply this to tuma? Then it's considered separate from the bowl, and it will be a problem. It will create a barrier between the water and the bowl, and it won't work to tovel it. Right? Toveling here, we mean, I gave the example of toveling my new dishes, but what we really mean here is the toveling they did, which was they took a bowl that became impure and they toveled it to make it pure. So it sounds like it all depends, is it kazayit or not? But the next line seems to say it all depends, do you care or do you not care? Meaning, are you makpid? So what does that mean? It means if I plan to clean it off the bowl at some point, then it's a problem. But if I'm never going to take it off because I want it to fill in my crack, then it becomes part of the bowl, and then it's not a problem. Now, that has nothing to do with whether it's a kazayit or whether it's not a kazayit. So this Mishnah really makes no sense. And what we're going to have in today's Gemara is 4 different interpretations, how to read this Mishnah. So let's start. Right? That's the very end of the Mishnah that the Gemara quotes here, with the bottom of Mem He Amud Bet. Midame, are these two things similar? The one we started with, right? The chametz for bal yireh bal yimatzeh, and the issue of the dunking in the mikveh. Midame hatam b'shiur talia milta. When it came to chametz, it was all about kazayit. Hacha big peta talia milta. Here, it's all about how much do you care. I see your question, Julie, about is it don't kli cheres, your earthenware vessels, you can't purify that. We're not talking about earthenware vessels. We're obviously talking about vessels that can be, like metal and other things. Amar Rav Yehuda. So first answer, easiest way to resolve a problem in a Tanaitic source is what do we do? Oh, change the words. Instead of saying ema, ema means let us suggest that it should say, instead of v'chein le'inyan tuma, and likewise, right, just like chametz tuma, u'le'inyan tuma ein okain. Make it say the reverse. Oh, but it's not the same for tuma. And then the Mishnah goes into what are the criteria for tuma. Okay, now there's a few problems with this. One of them we're going to see right now, which is Amar le Abaye v'ha v'chein le'inyan tuma katane. But you're changing the words. You can't just change the words. You can't say, and you're saying the exact opposite. You're going to take the words that it says here and you're going to say it means exactly the opposite. That doesn't make any sense to say that, right? So he says you can't just change the words like that. It says it's the same. Can't say that means, oh, it's the same means it's different. That's really too complicated. Secondly, you could also say if Tuma is different, then why are they even bringing up this case here? It's possible. I mean, you could say they're trying to create this foil and talk about the differences, but it would seem it's not like our topic is Tuma. What would that have to do with anything? If you're going to say there's a similarity, it makes sense that the Mishnah would mention it in Pesachim. If you're going to say the law is totally different, it would seem a little bit strange to mention here. But again, the Mishnah does sometimes go off on tangents, not as much as the Gemara does, but one could see maybe the Mishnah would do that. But in any case, Abaye rejects Rav Yehuda's reason. And he says, El Amar Abaye, Hachi Kamar. And he's going to change two things here. Okay. One is he's going to change what do we mean about Tuma? We assume Tuma meant take a kli and tovel it in the mikveh, and is it a chatzitza? Now, why did we think that? Well, it said chotzetz, right? It said if you're makpid, right, and you would take this out of the bowl, then it will create a barrier. So if we're talking about chatzitza, we assume what does it mean? It must mean for putting it in the mikveh. But he says, number one, the topic is different. Number two, those two lines, we have the cheling and tuma, and then we have, which means it all depends on the size, kazayit or not kazayit. And the second line, which is it all depends, are you makpid or not makpid? Do you plan to take it off or do you not plan to take it off? Those are two different cases entirely. They happen on two different days of the year. Okay, they're related to different times of the year. And so we're going to have two things. So one is we're changing the topic of what it means for Tuma. And secondly, we're going to split into two different scenarios. And then we're going to say the Cheling and Tuma is one scenario, and the other is talking about a different scenario. What's interesting about this is the two other explanations are going to accept the fact that he splits it into two. And it depends what day of the year you're talking about. But they're not going to accept what he says about Tuma. So he says, Hachikama, El Amar Abaye. So Abaye says Hachikama. We're now starting the top of Vav. Le'inyan seruf tuma, v'chein le'inyan tuma, seruf tuma bepesach. Ubishar yamot hashana ikaplugta. Okay, what does he say? Remember we talked about in order for something to either become tamei or maybe only to be able to pass on tuma. Remember talking about ochlin, we said there's a big machlok at Rashi and Tosfot about whether and others, about whether when we talk about the shear of a kibetza, the shear of an egg bulk, okay, not the olive that we normally talk about, has to be the shear of an egg bulk in order to, and then fill in the blank, either in order to pass on tuma to something else, or in order to both accept tuma and pass it on. That's the famous machlok at Rashi Tosfot. Rashi says it's only to pass on tuma and that it will become tamei any size it is. But Tosfot says, no, even to become tamei, it has to be a kibetza. Whichever one we're talking about, it doesn't really matter here which one. The idea is, let's say this, you had in the bowl something that was smaller than a kibetza, and it was touching this piece of dough that was smaller than a kibetza. And then the question is, do the two of them together join together? Can you call this chunk of dough food in order for it to combine with the other food? And let's say a sheretz touches them. So do we view this all as one big chunk of a kibetza or not? So depends. So what he says here is when it's bepesach, it all depends. Is the chunk a kazayit or not? If the chunk is a kazayit, okay, usually a kibetza is 2 kazetim. So let's say the chunk is a kazayit and it is touching another chunk of food that's really food, right? A real dough that's not stuck in the corner, right, as filling in a crack in a bowl. It's coming in contact with this other kazayit piece. The two of them can join together. But let's say the other piece was bigger than a kazayit and this one was less than a kazayit. Together they would equal a kibetza. But because the chunk that you filled in the crack is less than a kazayit, it's not going to join with the other one. And we're going to talk about why in 1 minute. Ubishar yamot hashana, whether this will work in a different day of the year. In other words, the rules for this are going to be different on Pesach and the other days. We don't yet understand why. We'll understand why in a minute. Ika plugta. Plugta usually means machloket. Here it doesn't mean machloket. It means machloket. What does machloket mean? It means there's a split. I hold one thing, you hold one thing. So here, what he's going to say is ika plugta, there's going to be a split, not a machloket, but a split between whether you're makpid or whether you're not makpid. So hold off, we'll explain all this right now. Hechidami. So what's the case? Kigon ika pachot mi kibetzat ochlin, right? So again, this is just describing what I already said. There's less than a kibetza in this chunk. Vinagu bahai batsek. Sorry, there's less than a kibetza in the bowl of something else. And it's touching the part of the bowl where this chunk is filling in, the chunk of dough is filling in the crack. Bepesach, the isuro chashuv mitztaref. On Pesach, since a kizayit is already going to be a problem for Bal Yer Bal Yimatzeh, as we learned in the beginning of the Mishnah, therefore, this kizayit chunk has significance as food, right? Because this is a classic example that we talked about many times in muktzah and Shabbat issues, that if I think it has importance, then it has importance, right? It could be the exact same thing. But if my intent is, or I have somehow value it, then it will have significance. And here it's valuing in a negative sense, because now it's going to be a problem for Bal Yer Bal Yimatzeh. So that means when it comes to Pesach, this has significance. If this has significance, then what's the issue? Then, okay, now when is it going to have significance? Only if it has a kizayit. If it's less than a kizayit, then it's not a problem with Bal Yer Bal Yimatzeh. It's part of the bowl. It's nothing. Once it has a kizayit, it has significance, then we can say that this kizayit combines with whatever food is touching it. If the two of them equal a kibetza, again, then it depends, fill in the blank, whether you're Rashi or Tosfot, then according to Rashi, it can pass on impurity to other things. According to Tosfot, if it doesn't have the kibetza, it won't even accept impurity. It won't even itself become impure. Okay, so then Tosfot's saying, if it has a kazayit and it's already significant, and it's touching another kazayit and the two of them together, I'm just giving kazayit here as an example, right? That as long as the chunk in the crack is a kazayit or more, it can join with some other food. And if the two of them together equal a kibetza, the size of an egg, then again, according to Tosfot, they will both become impure and pass on impurity. And if not, they won't. And according to Rashi, they'll become impure in any case, but they won't be able to pass on impurity unless together they have kibetza. So they can only join if that chunk is a kazayit or more. If the chunk is less than a kazayit, then it's just considered part of the bowl. It's not food. Remember, we're talking about tumat ochlin here. It has to be food. This isn't food. So it won't be in it. It won't be, it all depends on size. Now let's go to the Shar Yemot HaShana. B'Shar Yemot HaShana, where the kazayit, less than kazayit, is not relevant, because this isn't so important in any case, right? It doesn't, when it has ramifications for Bal Yer Bal Yimatzeh, that gives it significance at the size of a kazayit. In this case, size has nothing to do with it. What does it have to do with? Bikpeh detalya milta. Im makpid alav mitztaref. If I plan to clean this out of the bowl, what does that mean? I view it as food. I don't view it as filling in the crack. And therefore, it's food. Im rotzeh b'kiyumo, but if I want it to stay in the bowl forever, to fix that crack in the bowl, hareyu ka'arevad, then it's just part of the bowl. It all depends on what my intent is. Then when it comes to all the other days of the year, the size is irrelevant. It could be bigger than that. It could be smaller than that. It doesn't matter. It's all a matter of, do I want it in the bowl? If I want it in the bowl, then it's just part of the bowl and it's not food anymore. And it can't join with any other food for tumat ochlin. If I don't want it in the bowl, if I plan to take it out of the bowl, clean it out, then it's considered food still. That's an indicator that it's food. So again, he splits between Pesach and other days of the year. And he also talks about this issue that it's not about toveling it in the mikveh. Is it a chatzitza? It's an issue of, can this join with other food? Do we call it food? Can it join with other food to get to the shiur of a kibetza that we need for, again, depending on what you think a kibetza is the shiur of. Okay, next. Matkifla Rava. Rava says this is a bad interpretation. You probably could think about why. Because mi katani mitztaref, ha chotzetz katani. The words in the Mishnah said, if you're makpid, it's chotzetz. If you're not makpid, it's not chotzetz, which means tzitza means separation. Creates a separation. It's obviously talking about dunking things in a mikvah and not talking about tumat ochlin. Yes, if you just had the words v'chein and tuma, you could explain tuma could be either one. But because the continuation says it's all a matter of does it create a separation or not, it can't possibly be that you're right. So therefore, Rava has his own interpretation. Answer number 3. Ela amar Rava, v'chein laha'alot tahara la'arefa. He understands it the way we understood it originally, which is it's talking about purifying the bowl. If the bowl became impure and you want to purify it in a mikvah. But he's going to add one element, which we didn't have before. As I said, he's going to have that split between Pesach and the other days of the year, just like Abaye said. So what does he say? So that's just explaining the case. It became impure and he wants to bring it to the mikvah to purify it. If it's on Pesach, again, if it's a kizayit, the size of an olive bowl, then what are we going to say? That size, that object is significant, which means if it's significant, it's as if it's separate from the bowl and it's a problem. You can't tovel it in the mikveh. And obviously, if it's less than a kazayit, it won't be a problem. You can tovel it in the mikveh. And that's the v'chein l'inyan tumah. The second line about if he's makpid or not is obviously going to be b'shar yamot hashana. So b'pesach tisuro chashuv chotzetz v'lo sakal tefillah, it doesn't work. B'shar yamot hashana, but any other day of the year, big peda talia milta, it all depends on whether you plan to leave it there or not, which makes a lot of sense, right? Im makpid alav, there you can't say it's important to you based on the size, because any size you might decide, oh, I have a huge hole, I want to leave this in the bowl. It doesn't matter if it's kazayit. It all depends on, do I plan to leave it in the bowl permanently or not? So, im makpid alav chotzetz, if I plan to take it out of the crack, then it's considered something external to the bowl and I can't tovel it in the mikveh. But im rotzeh b'kiyumo, if I want it to stay there, ha'arehu ka'areva, then it's basically like the bowl. And then I can tovel it in the mikveh. Sounds like a good answer. And that's how we really understood the mission to begin with. But he fixes the problem of, it seems to be saying two things. Oh yeah, it is saying two things. One is Pesach, one is the other days of the year. Rav Papa doesn't like this for the following reason. Matkef la Rav Papa miktane v'chein l'inyan tahara, hal inyan tum'ah katane. Rav Papa says, it's true, it sounds like it's talking about chatzitza because it says chotzetz. But what's the problem? If you want to say that the topic is how to purify something in the mikveh, can you purify it, can you not? It should have said v'chein l'inyan tahara, purification, not v'chein l'inyan impurity. Impurity sounds like becoming tameh, and that's a little bit more like Abaye, who was saying, this is telling you, right, can something accept tumah? Can it pass on tumah? Impurity is the topic, not purity. On the other hand, it also says chotzetz, so it can't be like Abaye. So Rav Papa is going to come up with another interpretation. You can almost see the way it works. Each one is building on the last one, but fixing it up more to match what they think. It's almost like other people give you ideas, and then you take their idea and you take it one step farther. So comes Rav Papa and he says, Ela amar Rav Papa, v'chein l'inyan lahorid tum'ah la'areva. It's a matter of, did this bowl become impure? What's the situation? Hechidami, kigon dinaga sheretz b'hai batzek. Let's say a sheretz gets into the bowl. Remember, sheretz makes food tameh and makes vessels tameh. Now, if it makes a food tameh, what happens? The food becomes a rishon. If it makes a vessel tameh, the vessel becomes a rishon. But remember what we learned about food. If the food is a rishon, it can't pass on impurity to a vessel, to a kli, to the bowl. So let's say if we view it as food, what will happen? The sheretz touches the food, which is filling in the crack, but it's food it's touching. So if we view it as food, what will happen? Then the bowl doesn't become impure because the food, right, the impurity goes from the sheretz, who's an av, to the food, which becomes a rishon, and the food can't pass on impurity to the bowl. So the bowl, nothing touched the bowl. Now we understand what's a chatzitza, the separation between the sheretz and the bowl, right? This object is separating, preventing the sheretz from touching the bowl. If the sheretz touched the bowl directly, the bowl would obviously become tameh, but here you have food in the middle. So the question is food really in the middle or not? And that all depends. So let's read inside. Hechidami, so nagash sheretz b'hai batzek, so it touches that dough. Bepesach the isuro chashuv chotzetz. Again, if it's a kazayit and it's on Pesach, and because that's bal yareh bal yamatzeh, therefore we view it as separate from the bowl, and it basically prevents the impurity from getting to the bowl. V'lo nachtala tuma, and therefore tuma doesn't get onto the bowl. Bishar yamot hashana de bikpei detalia. With other days of the year, though, it all depends. Do I plan to take this out of the bowl or not? It all depends. Do I plan to take it out of the bowl? If I plan to leave it in the bowl permanently, then the sheretz touched basically the bowl because it touched the batzek, which is basically part of the bowl. So if that's the case, the bowl becomes impure. Again, it's all a matter. Do we view this as food or do we view it as part of the utensil? So if you view it, it's all a matter of what your intent was, right? Do you intend to take it out or not? Okay, so with that, we have our 4 answers about how to read the Mishnah. Moving on to the next Mishnah. Okay, I always do this alert of, the not necessarily a politically correct way of reading this Mishnah. Okay, the wording of this Mishnah is a little bit troublesome, although I will bring an interpretation that I like, that I found that is not as troublesome. But se kacheresh, deaf, okay, this literally translates as deaf dough. Okay, what this means, deaf dough, we're going to see it means a dough that didn't rise. Okay, so why is it called deaf dough? So it's a little bit troublesome, right? It doesn't sound very nice to someone who's hard of hearing. Some people say that what it means is, right, it's different than your average dough, okay? Different than the typical. Some people say it's deaf as in deaf mute, which doesn't speak. The dough often makes noises as it's rising, and there's no noise, or if you pound it, it would make a noise. There's no noise here to the dough because it doesn't really rise. Those are all, complicated interpretations. In Safrai's book, Mishnah Eretz Yisrael, he suggests, shin and sin, right, which are really the same letter, just a matter where you put the dot on which side. This is a shin, the way we read it, cheresh, which means deaf, but he says shin and sin often switch, and samach and sin often switch. And it could be cheres, which is earthenware, which means a hard as rock dough, which has nothing to do then with deaf, because it seems weird to be using deaf in this kind of manner. He claims it's possible it's really cheres. And what it meant to be is a hard dough, which basically never rose, because, right, it's a way of saying didn't rise, it's hard. So I prefer that one. But anyway, most of the Mepharshim don't understand it that way. But anyway, for whatever reason they call it, we'll just call it a dough that doesn't rise. Im yesh kayotze bo. Now the question is, how will you know if it doesn't look like it leavens? When do you call this a leavened dough? That would be a problem for Pesach. So im yesh kayotze bo shechmitz harei ze asur. So the Mishnah just gives you one option, which is if you have another dough that you made at the same time, whenever that one leavened, you can assume this one leavened, even though it doesn't look like it did. You have to assume that some sort of leavening process could have happened and you just don't notice, and you have to treat it as if it's leavened. So the Gemara obviously fills in what's missing in the Mishnah. Im ein sham kayotze bo mahu. But what do you do if you don't have another dough? You didn't happen to make two doughs at the exact same time. So what do you do then? And then they add meal. Okay, the amount of time it takes, we're going to measure it. This is often the way they do things. They're going to measure time in the amount of time it takes you to walk from Migdal Nunya to Tveria. That's what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said. You have to remember, okay, and Shuli Mishka does a good job of giving the historical context this week. She talks specifically about this sugya. Where's Migdal Nunya? So she says it's really known as the city of Migdal, which is not far from Tveria. And so it's the amount of time, and Rish Lakish is living in Israel, so he's describing the amount of time it takes to get from Migdal Nunya to Tveria, which is, the Gemara tells you, a meal. What's a meal? Right? And they say that Rish Lakish said it was a meal. A meal is the amount, it's a little less than a mile, and it's about 18 minutes. Some people say 22 minutes or 24 minutes. Okay, so we're basically going to say that that's the amount of time that you have. Basically, this is like our 18-minute rising rule. You can assume after 18 minutes, it rose. So the Gemara says, v'neima meal. Why didn't he just simply say meal? Why did he tell us the amount of time it takes from Migdal Nunya to Tveria? Shuli also says a bunch of things. Nunya has to do with fish. She talks about some excavations and things they found in the area. It's very interesting. It's a worthwhile read. So now, why didn't you just say meal? So they say, ha-kamash malan de shiura de meal kami Migdal Nunya va Tveria. They say, oh, it's to tell you that the shear of a meal is the time it takes to walk from there to there. They wanted you to know what a meal was, right? So they described it in words. What's the problem? As Shuli raises, and also I assume she might have gotten it from Safrai's book. There's no way that that's a meal, okay? It doesn't take 18 minutes to walk from Migdal to Tveria. It's more like 4 times that amount, okay? More like 4 meals. So keep that in mind for one more minute, and we're going to move on, and then we're going to come back to this. We now get a seemingly unrelated halacha, except that it has to do with a meal, but it doesn't really have to do with a meal. It has to do with 4 meal, which is going to lead us to maybe understanding things a little bit differently. So right now, the Gemara brings this other statement of Rish Lakish. Amar Rabbi Avahu, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Legabal u'letfila u'lenetilat yadayim arba'a milim. Okay, now, he says, oh, and likewise, we have this shear of 4 meal. Now, it would have made more sense if it had said, and likewise, we have a shear of 1 meal. But instead, he's talking about 4 meal. So you could say, oh, well, once they were talking about a meal, I'll give you things that also were defined in milim, in miles, the Roman mile. And, we'll call it these other things. What are these other halachot? Legabal. This is someone who's the dough kneader. Remember, we saw Abba Shal was a gabal. He was a kneader of dough. If you're kneading people's doughs and you don't have vessels that are pure, remember, many people were careful about eating things in purity, even if they weren't kohanim. If you're kneading the dough, how far do you have to go? Let's say you're walking, you're not like at home. How far do you have to go to find vessels that are pure? So they say you have to go the distance of 4 meal, basically, about an hour's walk. So, or a little more than an hour. So he says, for that, what else? For tefillah, tefillah b'minyan, how far do you have to walk? This is good. You live in a place where there isn't a shul nearby. How far do you have to walk? So they say 4 mil, right? So that's either 18, 22, or 24 times 4. You have to walk that far. U'lenitilat yadayim. Let's say you don't have water and you want to wash. You want to eat bread. How far do you have to walk to basically, and to wash your hands? So arba'a milim. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Aivu Amara. It wasn't Rabbi Yava who said the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, it was Aivu. And Arba'a Amarba. He actually said 4 things. He added one more. V'chad minayu ibud. What's ibud? This is a law about the hide of an animal. If an animal just dies, it's called a nevela. And the meat is tumat nevela. And tumat nevela, right? So if you have a dead animal, it carries impurity. Also, anything edible about it. So also the skin is edible. But this is kind of like the dough. At what point is it no longer edible? When you turn it into, let's say, a shoe, right? And you use it for a shoe and you put it through the tanning process and it now leaves being food and it moves into a different realm. So at that point, it's not tameh anymore. So kulan she'ibdan, if you did ibud to it, you processed it, or let's say you didn't process the leather, but you made a shoe out of it and then you walked on it. Now, walking on it would also create a process that would be like tanning, and you basically turn it into a shoe and it would no longer be food and therefore would no longer be impure. So what does it mean? Right? Then they're teholim. The tumah leaves it. It's now not considered food anymore. It's not impure. So they say, and by the way, they say chutz mi'or ha'adam. This isn't true for flesh of the skin of a person, only for animals. Bekama kedei avodah, how much is this? Amar Aivu, Amar Rabbi Yana, kedei hiluch arba'a milim. The amount of time you walk that would then turn this skin into leather for your shoes would be if you walk 4 mil. And now they say, Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, lo shanu ela lefanav, aval acharav afilu mil eno chozer. This, by the way, is only, and we've seen this before, it's only when you're walking in the direction where you have to go 4 mil. We're assuming this person is on the path to going somewhere. He's on the road. It's only if it's 4 mil in the direction you're going. You don't have to go backwards 4 mil. Let's say the only place you could do this, let's say when we're talking about finding a minion, okay, or water. It's only if it's 4 mil in the direction you're going. But if it's backwards, you don't even have to go 1 mil. So now what do they infer from this? You don't have to even go backwards 1 mil. Amarav acha umina. From there you can infer milhu de'eno chozer hapachot mimil chozer. But if it would be less than a Roman mile, then you would have to go back. Okay, so in other words, 4 mil is only going forward in the direction you're going. 1 mil would be, you don't have to go backwards 1 mil, but you would have to go backwards if it's less than a mil. Already that would make you go in a different direction. But let's just look at the sugya for a minute. And what Safrai claims, and Shuli mentions this in her article, is that what happened? The Bavliim are living in Babylonia. They don't know where Migdal is. They don't know where Tveria is, right? They only have maybe things they've heard from people, but they weren't there. And they have this opinion that the shear is a meal, right? That's the amount for a dough. So what do? They rewrite into the Eretz Yisrael opinion, their opinion. In other words, really Rish Lakish said from Migdal Nunya to Tveria, which is really 4 mil. And Rish Lakish must have had this opinion that it's 4 mil. And that's why they quote this other language, this other statement of Rish Lakish that talks about 4 mil. And that makes more sense in terms of the reality between the two locations. But the Bavliim had this masoret that it was a meal. So when they read Rish Lakish, this is classic. When you read something, you read it with what your understanding is. So they assumed, they didn't know where these places were. They just assumed that Rish Lakish meant, a meal, because it matches with their understanding. So therefore, this is possible that they're rereading the sugya in a different way than Rish Lakish actually meant it. So it's very likely that there's some sort of mistake here in terms of their tradition. And it's very common that the Bavliim read their understanding into the Israeli opinions, because that's just how they read things. So when he didn't describe an amount, right, they gave him an amount. And they said, he obviously meant a meal. But it's very likely he meant 4 mil. I think also in the Yerushalmi, it says 4 mil in his name, if I remember correctly. Okay, moving on. So if you want to read Shuli Mishnah's article, it's on, you can find it on the homepage on Hadran's site. She adds all sorts of interesting historical aspects of the city of Migdal, and it's a good read. Now we have a new Mishnah, new question. What happens if it's Yom Tov and you're making a dough, which you're allowed to do. You're allowed to bake on Yom Tov. So you're making a bread and your dough becomes impure. You're supposed to take challah from it. What's the problem? Well, you're in a quandary here because if you take your challah, challah is going to be impure. What can you do with impure challah? It's like impure truma. The only thing you can do with it is burn it or give it to the Kohen and he burns it. So theoretically, you should burn it, but you can't burn it because it's Yom Tov, and you're only allowed to cook things for food on Yom Tov. This is for burning. It's not for food on Yom Tov. So you can't burn it. So what do? Well, what would you do if you can't burn it? You'd leave it, and you'll burn it after Yom Tov. That sounds great. What's the problem? It's Pesach. If you leave this dough before Pesach, what will happen? It will leaven. So now you're stuck, right? If it's a regular holiday, you'll just leave it till after Chag. That's very easy. But on Pesach, you have to worry that the dough is going to leaven. So let's see what happens. Okay, so again, when do you take challah? Normally, it's in the dough form. You take the challah out, you bake the rest of the dough, you give that part to the Kohen. Either you bake it and give it to the Kohen, or you give it to the Kohen and the Kohen bakes it. In this case, you can't do any of that because it's tameh, so it has to be burnt. No one can do it. So you're stuck. What do? So your suggestion, Tova, is going to somewhat come up. You'll see. So we're going to have three possible answers about what to do. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, lo tikra l'Hashem ad shetofeh. Even though normally you take the challah before you bake it, in this case, take the challah after, right? It's less than ideal, but it's better than the alternative. So what do? Bake it all, because you're allowed to bake at that point, even though you know that some part of it will go to the Kohen. You don't know which part. It could be every loaf will be eaten by you, and just you'll take a piece of each to give to the Kohen. So theoretically, any loaf you bake really theoretically could be eaten by you on the Chag, right? We obviously don't mean bread, we mean matzah. And therefore, just wait till you're done, then take the challah and then put it aside. At that point, you don't have to worry about leavening, and you'll burn it after the holiday. Ben B'techa Omer, tatil b'tzonein. This is like what you were suggesting, Tova, put bleach on it. So he says, put it in cold water. If you put it in cold water, the cold water will stop it from leavening. We're going to see that nobody really deals with his approach. Maybe they just didn't think it was it was going to be a foolproof method. Maybe it's not going to work. They didn't really like it. So you're going to see the whole debate in our Gemara later is going to be between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Okay? But he suggests put it in cold water, and that will stop it from leavening, and leave it till after. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, lo zehu chametz shemutarim alav b'bal yireh or bal yimatzeh. This is not chametz that's a problem on Pesach. Why? Okay, we're going to see. Because what he says is, if you remember all our laws of bal yireh, bal yimatzeh, it has to be owned by you. This is really ownerless. Why is it ownerless? Because it's not yours, because you're supposed to give it to a Kohen. It doesn't belong to a Kohen because you didn't give it to any Kohen yet. It belongs to theoretically any possible Kohen, but it doesn't belong to anybody. So because of that, you don't own it. It's not a problem. And the Kohen doesn't own it, so it's not a problem. So there's no bal yireh, bal yimatzeh. And therefore, Ella, this is very simply, do what you would do otherwise. Leave it on the side. No one's going to eat it anyway. It's challah, right? Everyone knows it's challah. They're not going to eat the challah. Leave it. It rises. Who cares? It's fascinating to think that you could have this dough leavening in your house and it's not a problem. Okay. He basically says you don't own it, so it's not yours. Okay. Again, none of these are foolproof. And right, all these are somewhat problematic. Each one has its own problematic nature to it, which is why there's always multiple opinions, because nothing is a perfect answer. So now we're going to try to understand the debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Lema b'tovat hana'ah kamiflageh. Okay, the question is whether this belongs to you or whether it doesn't. And Rabbi Eliezer obviously thinks it does belong to you because he thinks you are over bal yireh, bal yimatzeh, and that's why he says don't create a situation where this is going to leaven because it's a problem. What is tovat hana'ah? Tovat hana'ah is that, and I'm a good example for this. I'm a bat kohen, but I'm married to someone who's not a kohen. So if, let's say, we have challah in our house, what will we likely do with it? We give it to my father, right? And then my father would be happy that we gave him something, right? And there's value to that. If I give my father all my challah, then he feels good about my relationship with him, and he might do something nice for me down the road. I mean, my father will do nice things for me anyway. But, or likewise, if it's my neighbor, the Kohen is maybe a better example, right? I give it to my neighbor, and then my neighbor knows I always give him my challah or my truma, so he'll do other things for me. That's called tovat hana'ah. The fact that I can decide who to give it to gives me power, so to speak, right? It gives me, and it gives me something in return because, right, you almost never get something for nothing, right? So basically, the question is, and this comes up in many different sugyot, is that have a monetary value to it? The fact that I will get a favor back from someone possibly, or I'll just be looked at favorably in their eyes because I give them my truma or my challah, is that considered financial value to me? If it is, then the fact that I have challah in my house and I can give it to someone, I can decide who I want to give it to. Now, remember what happens to this challah. It's true, in this case, it's not going to really be so great for whoever gets it because it's impure. But first of all, we're just talking about potentially. And second of all, they can use it for burning. Remember, they can, because you have to burn it, but you can benefit from the burning of it. So it still will serve them a purpose. So is that worth something? If it is, Rabbi Eliezer Savar Tovat Hana Mamon. He says it's worth something. It's considered money. If it's considered money, then that challah right now belongs to me. As long as I haven't given it to anybody, then I can basically decide that I'm going to give it to someone and that's worth money. That means it's now mine. I see, Sarah, that you're asking about you can't always give it to the same Kohen. That's true. That's another whole thing. But what we mean here is I can determine each time who I give it to, and each time I can get benefit from that. So now Rabbi Yeshua Savar Tovat Hanayin Amamon. He thinks it's not worth any. That's not a monetary value. Yes, it's true. I've done a favor for someone. Maybe I'll get something in return, but you can't put a value to that. That's not money, which means that this really doesn't belong to me at all. And that's why there's no problem with Bal Yareh, Bal Yimatzeh. So that's the Gemara's first suggestion. If you remember, I told you already, when it says lema, let us say, which was the first word here of the Gemara, we're going to reject it. So the Gemara says, lo, it's not true. Everyone agrees that Tovat Hana is not mamon. No, you can't put a money value to that. The machloket is, do we hold by hoil? We saw this the other day. This means since something theoretically can happen, therefore we apply as if it did. So what do we use here? To Rabbi Eliezer Saval, Ambrinan ho'il v'ibai itchalale mamonahu. Right now, this isn't mine. I separate as challah belongs to the Kohen. However, if I want to, okay, how do you do challah? You basically declare it challah. It's the same thing as taking a neder, a vow. I said something in words. That kind of thing, you can go to a chacham, and he can, run a wise person, he can basically remove it. You can say, listen, I made a mistake. I didn't mean to. For whatever reason, you can get it repealed. Okay, and then the whole dough will go back to being tevel. Maybe you don't want to give him that loaf, and you decide, that piece of the dough, you want to give him a different piece of the dough. So you can go back on it, which means that it's still, since theoretically, that's how the hoil works. Theoretically, you can undo what you did. Therefore, we're going to consider it your money right now because you have control over it. Rabbi Yeshua Savar lo amrin on hoil. No, if you took the challah, even though theoretically, we don't care that theoretically you can undo it. Right now, it's not yours. So therefore, it's not yours. No problem. Bal Yareh, Bal Yimatzeh. Since we brought up this issue of hoil, they're now going to go into a very interesting hoil and a big machloket Rabbi and Rav Chisda. In fact, the Daf Mishalahen dealt with this week. Also, you can find on the Hebrew side of our site, Shir and Chamutal, all about cooking on Yantif. Okay, and can you cook for Yantif for the next day? So ha'ofemi yom tov lechol. Let's say I'm cooking on Yantif, and I decide I'll make a bigger batch so that tomorrow I'll have lunch for the kids to take to school. Right? It's always good to have leftovers. So, right, assuming that you bake on Yantif, if you bake on Yantif or cook on Yantif, and you add for tomorrow. So, according to Rav Chisda Amar Lokeh, you get lashes for this. The only thing that's permitted on Yantif is to cook for Yantif. It's not permitted to cook for tomorrow. That's forbidden. Midoraita. That's like any other malacha you're doing. Yes, it's true. Malacha is allowed to cook, but only for Yantif. You can't start cooking for tomorrow. Rabba Amar Eino Lokeh. Rabba says, no, you don't get lashes for this. So what's the reason? Rav Chisda Amar Lokeh lo ambrinan ho'il umiklale orchim chazele. You can't say, well, since maybe theoretically guests might show up in the afternoon, so I'll make extra now, knowing that if I have leftover, I'll use it for tomorrow. You can't say that according to Rav Chisda. Rabba Amar Eino Lokeh ambrinan ho'il. He says you can always add on Yantif because you never know who's going to show up, right? You might say, time of a pandemic, things are a little different. You can't really have guests over, or if you have a closure going on, it's unlikely. But in normal circumstances, you never know, right? We all have this. There's certain people that this happens to, right? You never know who's going to drop by. And therefore, you can add as much as you want. It's fine. So that's another hoil machloket. Amar le Rabba le Rav Chisda. So now we're going to have two questions on Rav Chisda, and then tomorrow's daf is going to be also more questions on Rav Chisda, questions on Rabba. We're going to have a whole big discussion about this. It's going to go on for a while. But for today, we're going to have two questions, and the structure of them is identical. That's why I charted them out so you can see what's identical and what's different about them. So Rabba says to Rav Chisda, you don't think you say hoil? Well, there's a problem here. Hey, so how can you cook? If you can only cook in Yom Tov for that day, how do we permit cooking from Yom Tov to Shabbat? If Yom Tov from Chol is Asr Midoraita, it must be also forbidden Doraita to cook from Yom Tov to Shabbat. So Amalek, Mishum Eruv Tavshilin. Well, that's why we do an Eruv Tavshilin, right? That's where we take some food, we take two cooked items, we make a bracha on it to say basically we started our cooking, we're just continuing. It allows us to do it. To which Rabba asks, Hamarle, I don't understand. According to you, Midoraita tzarchei Shabbat nasim sorry, I skipped a line. Mishum eruv tavshilin sharina nisura deoraita. Wait a minute. If it's really forbidden deoraita to cook from Yom Tov to a regular day, you're going to take an eruv, and that eruv is going to permit you to do something that the Torah forbids you. That sounds crazy. Amalei says, no. You misunderstood the way this works. Midoraita tzarchei Shabbat nasim b'Yom Tov. What you can't do is Yom Tov to a whole where it's less sanctified. To Shabbat, you actually could cook because Shabbat is more sanctified than Yom Tov. But Rabbananu de Gazrabe, why do you need an Erev Tavshilin? You wouldn't need an Erev Tavshilin at all. But they say, oh no. The rabbi said you can't do it. Why? Shema Yomru ofimi Yom Tov af lechol. We're worried that people will think you can, then if we allow you to cook from Yom Tov to Shabbat, people might think you could do it to a regular day. Therefore, Kevan Yitzruchu Rabbanan Erev Tavshilin Ilei Kera. Therefore, the rabbis institute Erev Tavshilin, so you'll know it's only allowed because it's Shabbat, but it's not allowed in any other circumstance. So that's how Rav Chisda understands it. Next question against Rav Chisda. Eitive. Behema mesukenet lo yishchot ela kedei sheyuchal le'echol mimena kli zayit miba'od yom. Let's say you have an animal that's possibly going to die. If that animal dies, you won't be able to eat it. If you shecht it, you'll be able to eat it. It's not a treifa. You'd have to say it's not a treifa. A treifa is something else, but we're not going to get into that. If it's Yantif and you already ate your big lunch meal and you're not planning to eat more meat, but you don't want to lose this animal, you see all of a sudden it's about to die, so you're allowed to slaughter it as long as there's potential. That's what it says. If you have enough time that you could slaughter it, roast it, and eat a kazayid of it before Yantif ends, you can do it. So that sounds very much like since, right? Hoil, even though you're not really going to do it. It's just potentially you can eat, even though you're not actually going to eat. So Rabbah continues with his question. Right? I said, if you're going to potentially eat it, that's enough. But that's what we allow you to slaughter it. Remember, on Yantif, not only can you cook, you can also slaughter animals to cook them. But but according to you, who says you can't do hoil, why do we allow you to slaughter? Because it's a big financial loss. So again, the Gemara is going to ask the same question they just asked before. What? Just because of a financial loss? Sharina nisura deoraita, we're going to allow you to do something that's forbidden by Torah law, to slaughter an animal that you're not going to even eat today? Amar le'in. Why? Yes, it does work. Why though? Mishum efsei mamono gamar b'libo le'echol kazayit v'efshar le'kazayit basar below shchita. It's a little twisted, but it works like this. Since I know, because if say mamon, we consider people get very serious about any kind of financial loss. We know that, right? People get very crazy about it. Because of that, I know I'm going to really, it's not like just hoil, there's potential. I really want to theoretically eat that food. It's not just theoretical. It's because I know that if I plan to eat that food, I'll be able to save my animal. I'm going to plan to eat that food even if I'm not hungry. Doesn't mean I'm actually have to eat it. But I really seriously plan to eat that food because that's going to save my animal. So it's kind of because it'll save my animal and my financial loss, I basically in my head say, I really seriously plan to eat this, even if you don't really. But the potential there is more than just an average hoil. Oh, maybe guests will show up. That's just very random. This is much more serious. So Rav Chisda says in this case, we consider it as if you could eat it basically. Okay, we'll end here. And as I said, we're going to have more questions tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody. And if you haven't signed up yet for the skills course, you can still sign up. Lots and lots of people have registered already, in the hundreds already. We have about, I think, 350 people registered for both the Hebrew and the English together. So lots of people will be there. Please join. Have a great day, everyone.